Joel Goldsmith experienced something in 1946 that he rarely spoke about publicly. It wasn't dramatic. No lights, no voices, no supernatural phenomena. Just a quiet moment in his study when the entire nature of prayer collapsed and rebuilt itself in his consciousness. What he discovered that morning would become the foundation of every healing he ever witnessed. Most spiritual seekers spend decades perfecting their prayers, making them more eloquent, more passionate, more worthy. Joel discovered the opposite truth that morning. The prayer that transforms everything is the prayer you stop praying. Not because you've given up, but because you've finally understood what prayer actually is. This isn't about religious tradition or technique. It's about recognizing a presence that was never absent. Joel called this encounter the moment he stopped begging God and started beholding God. The difference between those two postures is the difference between struggle and grace, between years of effort and instantaneous transformation. This isn't theory. This is the secret that changed everything for him and countless others. Here's what actually happened that morning in Joel's study. He'd been preparing to pray for a student facing a serious health crisis. He opened his mouth to ask God for healing, and something stopped him. Not an external voice, but a sudden awareness that flooded his entire being. The awareness was simple and shattering at once. God doesn't respond to prayers because God isn't separate from you, waiting to be convinced. The entire premise of petitionary prayer collapsed in that moment. Joel realized he'd been trying to inform an infinite intelligence about problems that infinite intelligence already knew. He'd been trying to persuade a presence that is only love to act with love. The absurdity became crystal clear. What replaced his prayer was something entirely different. Not words, not requests, not even thoughts. Just a quiet receptivity, a listening, a beholding of what already is, rather than a pleading for what should be. Within that silence, something shifted in consciousness. Not his consciousness alone, but in the field of awareness itself. The student called 3 days later, completely healed. Joel spent the next several years testing this discovery carefully, methodically, almost scientifically. He would sit with people facing impossible situations, terminal diagnoses, financial ruin, broken relationships. And instead of praying for them in the traditional sense, he would practice this beholding, this recognition of presence, this receptive awareness. The results were undeniable, though not always immediate. Some healings happened within hours, others unfolded over weeks or months. But the pattern was consistent. When Joel stopped trying to change conditions through prayer and started recognizing the already present perfection of spiritual reality, conditions changed. Not because he made them change, but because his consciousness aligned with truth. This wasn't positive thinking or visualization. Those are still human efforts to manipulate reality. What Joel discovered was a different order of consciousness entirely. A consciousness that doesn't create or manifest or attract. A consciousness that simply recognizes what is eternally true. And in that recognition, the false appearances dissolve naturally, the way darkness dissolves when light enters a room. Why did Joel conceal this teaching from wider publication? Because it sounds too simple to be believed. Because people want techniques, formulas, steps to follow. This isn't a technique. It's a complete reversal of how most humans approach the divine. It challenges every religious assumption about prayer, about God's nature, about our relationship with the infinite. Joel feared this truth would be misunderstood, reduced to mere passivity or spiritual bypassing. It's neither. This beholding requires more spiritual strength than 1,000 fervent prayers. It requires you to stop controlling, stop manipulating, stop trying to bend reality to your will. It requires you to be still enough to recognize presence. The transformation this brings isn't just about getting your prayers answered. It's about discovering you never needed to pray in the first place, not in the way you've been taught. You needed to awaken to a presence that has always been present, a perfection that was never absent, a completeness that required nothing from you except recognition. This is the encounter Joel concealed. This is what changes everything. Margaret was a schoolteacher in Boston who studied with Joel in the early 1950s. She came to him with a diagnosis that her doctors said left her 6 months to live. Cancer had spread through her lymphatic system. She'd tried every treatment available, every prayer group, every healing technique. Nothing had worked, and she was preparing to die. Joel sat with her for an hour, and here's what's remarkable. He never once prayed for her healing. He never asked God to remove the cancer. He never visualized her healthy or affirmed her perfection. Instead, he sat in that deep, receptive silence, beholding the spiritual truth that disease has no reality in consciousness. Not denying her experience, but seeing beyond it. Margaret felt nothing during that session. No energy, no heat, no supernatural sensation. She went home discouraged, certain this approach was too passive to help. But 3 weeks later, her symptoms began shifting. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Within 2 months, her doctors found no trace of disease. They called it spontaneous remission. Joel called it the natural result of consciousness recognizing truth. Margaret lived another 43 years. She never had a recurrence. And she spent those decades teaching others this same principle, not through willpower or positive thinking, but through that quiet beholding Joel had shown her. The recognition that spiritual reality is already perfect, already complete, already whole. Thomas was a businessman facing bankruptcy in 1957. His company had been his life's work, built over 20 years, and now creditors were circling. He'd tried everything. More work, better strategies, desperate prayers asking God to save his business. The harder he tried, the worse things became. He was weeks from losing everything. A friend gave him one of Joel's books. Thomas read about this principle of beholding rather than beseeching, and honestly, he thought it was nonsense. How could not praying be more effective than praying? How could simply recognizing presence solve his crushing debt? But he was desperate enough to try anything, even something that made no logical sense. For 30 days, Thomas practiced what Joel taught. Every morning, instead of planning and worrying and begging God for help, he sat in silence. He stopped trying to fix the problem. He stopped asking for solutions. He simply became receptive to the presence that Joel described. Not expecting miracles, just practicing this new way of relating to the infinite. In the 4th week, something unexpected happened. A competitor he'd never met called with a merger proposal that solved every financial problem overnight. Thomas didn't create this solution through prayer. He didn't manifest it through visualization. The solution appeared when his consciousness stopped blocking it through fear and desperation. Sarah was a young mother whose child had been diagnosed with a severe developmental disability. Doctors said her daughter would never speak, never walk independently, never live a normal life. Sarah had prayed until her knees were raw. She'd begged, pleaded, bargained with God. Why wasn't he answering? What was she doing wrong? She found Joel's work through a study group in 1961. The idea that she should stop praying for her daughter seemed cruel at first, almost negligent. But as she understood the principle deeper, she realized Joel wasn't asking her to stop caring. He was asking her to stop seeing her daughter as broken, as needing to be fixed by divine intervention. Sarah began practicing this beholding every day, not trying to change her daughter's condition, but recognizing the spiritual perfection that existed beyond physical appearance. She stopped seeing disability and started seeing wholeness, not as denial, but as a deeper vision of reality. This shift took months to stabilize in her consciousness. Her daughter's progress was gradual but undeniable. First words came at age 5, walking at 6. By age 10, she was in regular school classes. Doctors were baffled. Sarah knew what had happened. Not a miracle that defied reality, but a consciousness that aligned with a deeper reality. The reality Joel had discovered in his study that morning in 1946. These aren't isolated cases. Joel documented hundreds of similar experiences over his 30 years of teaching. Healings of tuberculosis, heart disease, financial disasters, broken relationships, addictions. Not through begging God for intervention, but through this practice of beholding presence, of recognizing what is already true in spiritual consciousness. What makes these stories credible is their consistency. The pattern is always the same. Someone stops trying to change conditions through human effort or desperate prayer. They learn to rest in receptive awareness of presence. They practice seeing beyond appearances to spiritual reality. And gradually, sometimes suddenly, conditions align with that deeper vision. This isn't a guarantee that every problem vanishes instantly. Some healings took months. Some situations required practical action alongside spiritual awareness. But the consciousness shift was always the foundation. When you stop relating to God as a distant power you must convince, and start recognizing presence as your very consciousness, everything changes. Joel concealed the depth of this teaching because he knew it would be misunderstood, dismissed as too passive, or worse, turned into another spiritual technique to master. It's not a technique. It's a complete transformation of your relationship with the divine, from separation to union, from begging to beholding, from prayer to presence. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others discover Joel Goldsmith's hidden wisdom, subscribe for more profound spiritual teachings, and comment which healing story touched your heart most deeply today. So how do you actually practice this beholding that Joel discovered? First, understand what it's not. It's not meditation in the traditional sense, not concentration, not visualization, not affirmation. Those are all activities of the human mind trying to reach God. This is the opposite. This is becoming receptive to the God that is already present within your own consciousness. Joel would begin by sitting quietly, releasing all sense of personal effort, not trying to achieve anything, not trying to become spiritual, not trying to fix any problem, just sitting in a state of alert relaxation. Some called it listening prayer, but you're not listening for words or messages. You're listening with your entire being to the presence that sustains all existence. As thoughts arise, and they will, you don't fight them. You simply return to receptivity. Joel often used the phrase, "Be still and know." Not know intellectually, but know through direct recognition. Know the way you know you're breathing without having to think about it. This knowing is prior to thought, prior to belief, prior to religious concepts. The practice isn't about duration. 5 minutes of genuine receptivity is more powerful than 5 hours of mental prayer. Joel would sometimes sit for only moments before feeling that click of recognition, that subtle shift where personal consciousness dissolved into universal presence. That's when healing happens, not through your effort, but through your transparency to truth. Another powerful technique Joel taught was what he called impersonalization. When facing a problem, any problem, the human tendency is to personalize it. This is my disease, my lack, my broken relationship. Personalization keeps the problem locked in your individual consciousness, where it feels overwhelmingly real and permanent. Joel taught the opposite. Instead of claiming the problem as yours, you recognize it as a universal belief in separation from God. Not your personal failure or bad luck, but a collective hypnosis that humanity has accepted for millennia. This isn't minimizing your pain. It's seeing it in a larger context that makes it easier to release. You're not battling your unique demon. You're awakening from a shared dream. Joel would say, "This disease isn't mine. It's the appearance that comes from believing in life separate from God. And since separation is impossible, this appearance has no real power. Feel the difference? You've moved from personal victim to universal awakener. From, 'Why is this happening to me?' to, 'This is the human condition I'm learning to see beyond.' This impersonalization doesn't happen through willpower. It happens through understanding. As you practice beholding presence, you naturally start seeing problems as appearances rather than realities, like mistaking a rope for a snake in dim light. The snake never existed. You don't fight the snake. You turn on the light and see the rope. That's impersonalization. That's healing through recognition rather than through battle. Joel also taught a principle he called attaining the altitude. Imagine problems exist at sea level, where the air is thick with human beliefs, fears, and limitations. Most prayer happens at this same level. You're standing in the problem, breathing its air, trying to fix it while completely immersed in the consciousness that created it. This rarely works. Attaining the altitude means lifting your consciousness above the problem entirely, not through escape or denial, but through recognition of a higher reality. Like climbing a mountain until you can see the whole landscape clearly. The problem hasn't changed, but your perspective has. And from this altitude, solutions become visible that were impossible to see from ground level. How do you attain this altitude? By practicing the beholding we've discussed. By releasing personal effort and becoming receptive to presence. As you rest in that awareness, you naturally rise above the dense consciousness of problems. You don't try to rise. Rising happens when you stop weighing yourself down with fear and struggle. Joel said you'll know you've attained the altitude when you feel a quiet confidence that has nothing to do with circumstances. Not false optimism or forced positivity, but a deep knowing that spiritual reality is already perfect. From that altitude, the conditions at sea level begin adjusting themselves, not because you manipulated them, but because consciousness has shifted to truth. The final technique Joel emphasized was consistency over intensity. Many spiritual seekers have powerful experiences during workshops or retreats, then return to ordinary life and wonder why the magic faded. Joel taught that transformation isn't about peak experiences. It's about steady, daily practice of recognition. 5 minutes every morning of genuine beholding is more powerful than occasional hours of intense prayer. Think of it like tuning an instrument. You don't tune a guitar once and expect it to stay perfect forever. You tune it regularly, sometimes daily. Consciousness works the same way. The world constantly bombards you with suggestions of lack, fear, disease, limitation. These suggestions pull you back to sea level. Daily practice of beholding pulls you back to altitude. Joel would recommend starting each day with this receptive silence before doing anything else. Before checking your phone, before planning your day, before engaging with problems. Give yourself just 5 to 10 minutes to remember presence, to recognize the perfection that exists before thoughts, before conditions, before human concerns. Let that recognition set the tone for your entire day. And when problems arise during the day, pause, even for 30 seconds. Return to that receptive awareness, not to fix the problem through spiritual technique, but to remember the presence that is already whole, already perfect, already complete. This isn't escaping reality. This is recognizing the deeper reality that human senses often miss. That's the practice. That's the transformation. But let's address the obstacle that stops most people from practicing Joel's teaching effectively. They try it for a few days or weeks, see no immediate results, and conclude it doesn't work. They return to begging prayers or give up on spirituality altogether. This is the critical mistake Joel warned against repeatedly. This practice isn't about immediate results. It's about consciousness transformation. Here's what actually happens in the early stages. You sit in receptive silence, expecting some feeling or experience. Nothing seems to happen. Your mind wanders. Problems feel just as real. You feel like you're wasting time. This is completely normal. You're unwinding years or decades of conditioning that taught you to manipulate reality through effort. That unwinding takes time. Joel said the first month is the hardest. Your ego rebels against this practice because ego survives through control. When you stop trying to control through prayer or willpower, ego panics. It tells you this isn't working, that you need to do something more active, more aggressive. If you can persist through this resistance without judging yourself, something begins shifting. Most people who abandon the practice do so in this crucial first month. They think they're doing it wrong or that they're not spiritual enough. But Joel insisted there's no doing it wrong. If you're sitting in silence with the intention of recognizing presence, you're doing it right. Results come from consistency over time, not from perfect technique. The question isn't whether you feel anything. The question is, are you showing up? Another common obstacle is what Joel called metaphysical malpractice. This happens when people try to use spiritual principles to manipulate reality for personal gain. They practice beholding, but secretly they're still trying to get something. A healing, money, a relationship. This subtle agenda blocks the very transformation they're seeking. Why? Because they're still operating from the consciousness of lack. True beholding has no agenda. You're not practicing to get healed. You're practicing because recognizing presence is its own fulfillment, regardless of what happens to conditions. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. When you practice to get something, you're affirming that you don't have it. That consciousness of lack perpetuates lack. When you practice simply to recognize truth, healing happens naturally as a side effect. Joel saw this pattern constantly. Students would come to him frustrated that the principles weren't working. He'd ask about their practice, and inevitably they'd reveal they were still trying to achieve specific outcomes. He'd gently redirect them. not toward different techniques, but toward releasing the need for outcomes entirely. Paradoxically, when they stopped trying to get healed, healing often appeared. This doesn't mean you can't have desires or preferences. You're human. But during the practice of beholding, those desires must be temporarily set aside. You're not trying to convince God of anything. You're not trying to create anything. You're simply recognizing what is already true. That recognition, free from agenda, has more power than 1,000 desperate prayers. The third major obstacle is inconsistency. People practice intensely when facing crisis, then abandon the practice when things improve. This is human nature, but it limits transformation. Joel compared it to taking antibiotics. You don't stop halfway through the prescription just because you feel better. You complete the course to ensure full healing. Spiritual practice works similarly. Joel recommended practicing whether you need anything or not. When life is good, practice recognizing the presence that sustains that goodness. When life is difficult, practice recognizing the presence that exists beyond difficulty. This consistency builds spiritual stamina. It transforms practice from emergency response into a way of life. That's when the deepest healings happen. Think of it this way. If you only called a friend when you needed something, that wouldn't be much of a friendship. Your relationship with the divine works the same way. When you practice only in crisis, you're treating God as a cosmic vending machine. When you practice consistently, you're developing an actual relationship with presence. You're learning to recognize it in all circumstances. Joel's students who experienced the most profound transformations were invariably those who practiced daily for months or years. Not because practice earns God's favor, but because consistency rewires consciousness. It gradually dissolves the habitual patterns of fear and separation. It makes beholding your natural state rather than an occasional technique you remember during emergencies. The final obstacle Joel identified was perfectionism. Students would judge themselves harshly for having doubts, for mind-wandering, for not feeling spiritual enough during practice. This self-judgment creates tension that blocks the very receptivity they're trying to cultivate. Joel was remarkably compassionate about human imperfection. He understood that consciousness transformation is gradual, messy, full of setbacks. If you sit down to practice and your mind races with worries, that's not failure. That's an opportunity to practice returning to receptivity. If you feel nothing during your practice, that's not a sign you're doing it wrong. Feeling is not the goal. Recognition is. And recognition often happens below the level of emotional sensation. Trust the process even when you can't measure results. Joel would say, "You're not trying to become perfect at this. You're practicing releasing the belief that you need to be perfect." See the difference? Perfectionism is another form of ego control. It says you must master this technique before healing can happen, but healing happens through surrender, not mastery, through transparency, not perfection, through being willing rather than being worthy. Give yourself permission to be human while practicing something divine. Your practice doesn't have to look impressive or feel mystical. It just has to be consistent and sincere. Show up daily, even when it feels pointless. Return to receptivity, even when your mind resists. Trust that consciousness is transforming beneath the surface, even when you see no evidence. That trust itself is the practice deepening. If these obstacle-breaking insights resonate with your journey, like this video to support the message, subscribe for more advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment which obstacle you're ready to release right now. Now let's explore how Joel applied this beholding practice to specific life situations. Money was one area where students struggled most. They'd practice recognizing presence, but then check their bank account and feel crushed by the numbers staring back. How do you behold abundance when concrete lack surrounds you? Joel's answer was brilliant in its simplicity. He taught that money is never the real need, ever. When you think you need money, you actually need what you believe money provides. Security, freedom, respect, possibilities. And here's the key. Those qualities are spiritual realities that exist independent of material currency. Security is a state of consciousness, not a bank balance. Freedom is recognizing you're not imprisoned by conditions. So instead of practicing to get money, you practice recognizing the spiritual abundance that is already present. Not by denying you have bills to pay, but by seeing beyond the material picture to the infinite supply that consciousness can express in countless forms. Sometimes that supply comes as money, sometimes as unexpected gifts, opportunities, or reduced expenses. The form doesn't matter. Joel had a student who practiced this for months while drowning in debt. Nothing seemed to change externally, but internally, his relationship with money completely transformed. He stopped feeling desperate, stopped making fear-based decisions. From that consciousness shift, better opportunities appeared naturally. Within a year, his finances had stabilized completely. Not through attracting money, but through becoming transparent to supply. Relationships were another area where Joel's teaching proved powerful, but required patience. People wanted to use spiritual principles to change their spouse, attract a partner, or fix a broken relationship. Joel was clear: you cannot use consciousness to manipulate another person. That would be mental coercion, not spiritual healing. But you can change your own consciousness about the relationship. Here's what this looks like practically. You're in conflict with your partner. The human response is to pray that they'll change, see your perspective, apologize. Joel taught the opposite. You practice seeing beyond their human personality to their spiritual reality. You recognize that in truth, they are not separate from God, not separate from love, not the limited person your judgments have made them. This isn't pretending problems don't exist. It's seeing beneath problems to essence. As you practice this beholding, something remarkable happens. Not always, but often. The other person begins responding differently, not because you manipulated them spiritually, but because your consciousness shifted. You stopped relating to them through judgment and separation. They feel that shift energetically and respond to it. Joel had a couple on the brink of divorce who both studied with him separately. Neither knew the other was practicing this beholding. Within 3 months, without discussing their issues directly, the marriage healed. Each had stopped trying to change the other and started recognizing spiritual perfection. That recognition dissolved the resentment and fear that had poisoned their connection. The relationship they wanted had always existed. They just needed consciousness to align with it. Health challenges require perhaps the most courage to approach through Joel's method. When you're in physical pain or facing serious diagnosis, the instruction to stop praying for healing can feel irresponsible or even dangerous. Joel never suggested ignoring medical care. He suggested adding spiritual recognition to whatever practical steps you're taking. But that recognition must be genuine, not desperate. The key is understanding what Joel meant by recognizing spiritual perfection. He wasn't asking you to deny your symptoms or pretend you feel fine. He was asking you to recognize a deeper reality. Your true being, your consciousness, exists beyond physical form. That consciousness is whole, complete, untouchable by disease. This isn't metaphor. This is the fundamental nature of what you actually are. As you practice beholding this truth, you're not creating your healing through positive thinking. You're aligning your consciousness with a reality that already exists. Physical conditions are effects, not causes. When consciousness shifts to truth, effects gradually align, sometimes quickly, sometimes over months. But the alignment is inevitable when the consciousness shift is genuine and sustained. Joel worked with a man given 3 months to live with advanced heart disease. The man practiced this beholding daily for 6 weeks, expecting nothing but doing it anyway. His symptoms stabilized, then improved. 2 years later, his doctor found no trace of disease. The doctor had no explanation. Joel did. Consciousness had aligned with truth. The body, which is always an expression of consciousness, simply reflected that alignment. Career and purpose questions also respond to this practice, though in unexpected ways. People would come to Joel wanting to know their life purpose, their calling, what they should do with their lives. Joel would redirect the question. Instead of seeking purpose externally, recognize the presence within. Purpose flows naturally from that recognition. You don't find it. It finds you. He taught that when you're trying desperately to discover purpose, you're operating from the consciousness of lack. I don't know what I should be doing. But when you practice beholding presence daily, something shifts. You become more sensitive to inner guidance. Not dramatic voices or visions, but quiet knowings. Subtle inclinations. Doors opening unexpectedly. Purpose reveals itself through this receptivity. Joel had a student who spent 5 years searching for meaningful work, changing careers multiple times, always feeling unfulfilled. Joel told her to stop searching and start practicing. For 6 months, she simply sat in receptive silence each morning, recognizing presence without asking for direction. Then one day, a clear knowing emerged. Not what she expected, but unmistakable in its rightness. She followed that knowing despite its impracticality. Within 2 years, she'd built a career that fulfilled her completely while serving others meaningfully. She hadn't found her purpose through strategic planning. She'd become receptive to purpose finding her. That's how divine order works. Not through human striving, but through human transparency. When you stop blocking the flow with desperate seeking, life itself shows you the way. As we approach the completion of Joel's hidden teaching, let's integrate everything into a daily practice you can actually live. This isn't about perfection or intensive spiritual discipline. It's about gentle consistency that gradually transforms consciousness from the foundation up. Joel believed any sincere person could practice this, regardless of religious background or spiritual sophistication. Morning is ideal for practice because consciousness is naturally more receptive after sleep, before the day's concerns dominate attention. Set aside just 10 minutes. Sit comfortably where you won't be disturbed. Close your eyes or keep them softly focused. Take a few deep breaths to settle, then release all effort. You're not trying to achieve anything. You're simply becoming present to presence. As thoughts arise, and they will constantly at first, gently return to receptivity. Don't fight thoughts. Don't judge yourself for having them. Just acknowledge and release. Return to listening, to that alert stillness, to recognition without words. Some days will feel profound. Most days will feel ordinary. Both are equally valuable. You're not practicing for experiences. You're practicing for transformation. Throughout your day, whenever you remember, take 30-second pauses. Return to that receptive awareness you touched in morning practice, especially when facing challenges or decisions. This isn't escaping problems. It's touching the consciousness that sees beyond problems. Over time, these micro-practices become natural. Presence becomes your default state rather than an occasional practice. That's when life itself becomes the meditation. Joel also recommended what he called spiritual homework. At the end of each day, review what happened without judgment. Where did you remember presence? Where did you forget and react from fear or ego? This isn't for self-criticism. It's for learning, for becoming more conscious of your consciousness, for recognizing patterns that keep you stuck in old responses. As you notice these patterns, don't try to fix them through willpower. That's still human effort. Instead, bring them into your morning practice. Recognize that the pattern itself is just an appearance, a belief in separation that has no reality in truth. As you behold presence, the pattern gradually loses power. Not because you fought it, but because consciousness shifted to truth. Joel emphasized patience with this process. You've spent decades building current consciousness patterns. They won't dissolve overnight. Some students saw dramatic changes within weeks. Others needed months or years of consistent practice. Both timelines are valid. The transformation isn't about speed. It's about direction. Are you moving toward recognizing presence or away from it? That's the only question that matters. And here's something Joel rarely said publicly but told close students. This practice never ends. It's not a technique you master and then abandon. It's a way of life. Even after profound awakening experiences, you continue practicing. Not to achieve something more, but because recognition itself is the point. Presence isn't a means to an end. Presence is the end. Recognizing it is complete fulfillment. What does life look like after months or years of this practice? Joel was honest about this. You don't become superhuman. You don't transcend all problems. You remain fully human with human challenges. But your relationship to those challenges transforms completely. What used to trigger fear now triggers presence. What used to feel overwhelming now feels manageable. Not because circumstances improved, but because you're seeing them differently. You'll notice increased synchronicity, not because you're attracting it through manifestation techniques, but because you're more aware of the divine order that was always present. Doors open at the right time. Resources appear when needed. relationships become more authentic. Not through manipulation, but through your increased transparency. People respond to the presence they feel in you, even if they can't name it. Your desires begin shifting naturally. Things you thought you wanted lose their appeal. Deeper longings surface, not for material success, though that may come, but for meaning, for contribution, for love. You find yourself less interested in getting and more interested in giving. This isn't forced. It flows naturally from consciousness that recognizes abundance rather than lacks it. Most importantly, you develop an unshakable inner peace that circumstances can't destroy. Not because you've escaped life's difficulties, but because you've found something in consciousness that remains untouched by difficulties. Joel called this the peace that passes understanding. It doesn't make logical sense. It doesn't depend on everything going well. It simply is. And once you've tasted it, nothing else satisfies quite the same way. So here's Joel Goldsmith's hidden teaching in its essence. Stop trying to get God to do something. Recognize that God is already being everything. Your job isn't to create, manifest, or attract. Your job is to become receptive to what already is. To behold rather than beg. To recognize rather than request. This complete reversal of spiritual practice is what Joel discovered that morning in 1946. Will this work for everyone? Joel would say it works for everyone willing to practice consistently without demanding immediate proof. It's not about worthiness or spiritual advancement. It's about willingness. Willingness to sit in silence even when nothing seems to happen. Willingness to return to presence when fear tempts you back to begging. Willingness to trust a process that defies human logic. The encounter Joel concealed wasn't with some external divine being. It was with his own consciousness recognizing itself as one with infinite consciousness. That recognition is available to you right now. Not someday when you're more spiritual. Not after you've perfected some technique. Right now. This moment. As you read or hear these words, presence is already present. Can you feel it? Can you recognize it? That recognition is the prayer that transforms everything. Not your words about God, but your awareness of God. Not your requests, but your receptivity. Not your spiritual accomplishments, but your spiritual transparency. This is what Joel concealed because it's too simple to be believed, too quiet to be dramatic, too interior to be proven. But for those willing to practice it, this teaching changes absolutely everything. If Joel Goldsmith's concealed wisdom has expanded your consciousness today, like this video to help others discover this transformative teaching, subscribe for more profound spiritual insights, and comment, "I am presence," to affirm your new understanding of prayer.